So I don't have to remind you what this evening's teaching is about. I've been announcing it ad nauseum, almost ad absurdum for the last couple of weeks. My Latin is a little bit rusty, but I think I'm on par there. I've been telling us that we're going to journey through the Gospel of Matthew, and that's what I've been trying to take us on, this walk of faith, which started a couple of weeks ago on Shrove Tuesday. Why the Gospel of Matthew? Probably because we've already dealt with Mark. Last year we went into quite a bit of intense research regarding the Gospel of Mark, and I think a week or two ago in one of the services I kind of opened my heart to you, saying that I always get confused with the order of the New Testament Gospels. In my mind, it's Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, and not Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I am a very linear person, and so I love placing things chronologically. Debbie will tell you all about it. That's how I strictly run our office. And on one of my desks, plural, on one of my desks in the office, you will find the orders of service in rigid concession, or succession at least, where you know it's Sunday 15 March, Sunday 22 March, Sunday 29 March, so that there's absolutely no possibility of any confusion. So you can just imagine how agitated I become when I open the New Testament, and Matthew's the first one, absolutely throwing around the chronological order of how those materials were written. Anyway, it's something that I've had to accept. So just for your information, please always remember that Mark was written before all the others. And as we study the New Testament, you will quickly find that it actually matters keeping that in mind. I want to talk a little bit, oh, you've done this, great. I want to talk a little bit this evening about who Matthew was, about why he did what he did, and how he ended up in our New Testament. Now, many people don't know or easily forget that the New Testament was written in Greek. We have the Old Testament in its original form, having come to us in Hebrew, of course, but the New Testament was actually written in Greek. It was written in everyday Greek, known as Koine Greek. K-O-I-N-E. So it wasn't the Greek of the philosophers and the educated classes. It was conversational Greek, the language that was spoken on the street. The language that Jesus spoke would have been Aramaic, which had become a modern version of Hebrew. So I normally try and explain that comparing Shakespearean English of centuries ago with modern day English. So Aramaic was derived from the original Hebrew, and that's what the Jews spoke by the time of Jesus in the New Testament. There were three languages of antiquity. Of course, the Hebrew, then there was Latin, but Greek was also still very important in New Testament times. Only 3 centuries before Jesus had Alexander the Great built the Greek Empire and brought in what is known as the policy of Hellenization. He tried to make the known world Greek. And so by the time of Jesus, Greek was still widely spoken. Here's an interesting fact about the New Testament. We have only one Greek-speaking author in the New Testament. All the other writers of the books in the New Testament wrote in a second language. So like I speak English as a second language, Afrikaans is the language my mother speaks. So that's the kind of language we have in the New Testament. The only person who had Greek as a first language would have been Dr. Luke. And it's often been said that the first 4 verses of Luke's Gospel, so Luke chapter 1 verses 1 to 4, is some of the best ancient Greek ever written. So he indeed was a very learned and very sophisticated man. So we've got the Gospel of Matthew having come to us in Koine Greek, the conversational language spoken by the average person of the day. The second thing that we need to be reminded of is that when we talk about Matthew, we talk about the former tax collector. And for those who were here this morning, you will remember that that was what the sermon was all about. So we have to make this link, that there is this tax collector who Jesus calls from his tax collecting booth, and then he journeys with Jesus for 3 years as a disciple. He is one of the 12, and then about 40 years on, he puts pen to paper and puts down his gospel in black and white. So the timeline of the New Testament is of vital importance for this study, okay? Who can tell me in what year Jesus was born? There's no year 0 on the calendar, so we go from 1 BC to 1 AD. So Jesus, for our purposes, was born in 1 AD. I'm not going to now go into the details of us being more or less 4 years out. So this is actually already the year 2030, but it's just going to really complicate things. We're going to stick to the calendars we know. So Jesus was born in 1 AD and died in about 33 AD. These are just easy calculations, okay? We might be out here and there, but that's not going to be too important. When did Jesus start announcing the kingdom of God having come near? More or less in 30 AD, when he was 30 years of age. And his public ministry and demonstration of the kingdom lasted for about 3 years. He had drawn to himself a group of 12, and if you want those names, you can find them in Matthew chapter 10, verses 1 to 4. It's one of the few places where we have the names of the 12 disciples listed clearly. We know the main guys, of course, like Peter, Thomas, John, Matthew, etc., etc. But there are also some of them who are quite obscure, like Thaddeus, for instance, and Alphaeus, and so on. But you can find the list in Matthew chapter 10. What we need to know regarding Matthew is that several decades passed between Jesus' ascension into heaven and when the Gospels were written. And I will put that up here in a second. This morning we also learned something very interesting, that there are some gospel authors that include some material exclusively in their writings. Can anybody take a wild chance if you manage to remember what that German word is when something is unique to a gospel? Sondergut. You don't have to say it with a German accent. You can anglicize it. Sondergut, Sondergat, I suppose, okay? So we ascertained this morning that Matthew's conversion, the chapter I preached on, Matthew 9, verses 9 to 13, is unique to Matthew. And I'm always so glad that he put in that personal bit of detail there. Otherwise, we would never have known how he came to Christ. Of course, each gospel has what is unique to them. What is absolutely fascinating is that there's very little unique to Mark. There's very little Sondergutmarken material. I think about Mark's material, there's only about, let me get it right, 13 verses that are unique to Mark. Because remember, the later gospel authors, such as Matthew and Luke, used Mark as a basis. So they repeat a lot of Mark's material in their work. We need to ask ourselves today, what is a gospel? I've put the question up on the screen there. Does anybody know where this word comes from? The Greek would be evangelion. That's the word we derive words such as evangelism and evangelization from. The evangelie in Afrikaans. What is the root word for gospel? It comes from the Old English God spell. And the word spell is an Old English word for story. So we have God's story or the story of God. It eventually went from God's spell to gospel. What is a gospel? We sometimes very incorrectly fall into the trap of calling them biographies of Christ. which I suppose it's a place to begin, but it's not 100% accurate. For quite a few of the Gospels actually don't deal with Jesus' life story from beginning to end. For instance, Mark doesn't give us any birth narratives. We don't read about the stable in, the manger and the stable and the starry night. Mark doesn't mention wise men or angels singing or shepherds watching over their flock by night. So it is a bit misplaced calling a gospel a biography. What sets the Gospels apart from biographies? It would be this. The Gospel, of the four, the Gospels always emphasize a particular side of Jesus' life and ministry. And that is why not all of them include all the details. One day when we've got time, we will have a big teaching where we put the four Gospels in our canon next to each other and compare them and see why Matthew stresses things that Mark chooses to leave out and vice versa. All of them had a particular plot and plan in mind when they wrote their Gospel. For instance, Luke is known as the universal gospel because he goes out of his way to show that Jesus' ministry was outreach to all people, particularly the poor and the downtrodden. Matthew, we will see later this evening, focuses on the Jews being converted to Christ, and that is his main aim sort of thing. He writes almost exclusively, trying his best to make Jews realize that Jesus is God's anointed, or also known as the Messiah. That is what the word Christ means. It comes from the Greek Christos, which means anointed one. Now that we've ascertained what a gospel is, we need to also talk a little bit more about what synoptic gospels are. Everybody here should know that there are three synoptic gospels in our canon. Number 1, Matthew. Number 2, Mark, and number 3, Luke. John is the one who is totally different. Not only does he take an entirely different approach, even his order of events, and that's what I struggle with, his order of events does not compare to the order of events of the synoptics. And you can just imagine what games it plays with my mind, particularly if the chronology is messed with. So we've got 3 synoptic gospels. What does the word synoptic mean? It is a mixture of 2 Greek words meaning from the same point of view. So it would probably be syn something and optic, of course, being a viewpoint or a perspective. When one compares the 3 synoptic gospels, you will see that you see, I always start with Mark. Matthew, Mark, and Luke have more or less the same journey for Jesus. They also don't change the order of events. Now, the main reason for this is that when Matthew came along, he used Mark as his basis, and later when Luke wrote, he used both Mark and Matthew as his basis. So it's little surprise that the order was kept the same. John, of course, is the convoluted one, a very complex book with lots of layers and lots of Sondergut material. What do I mean when I say Sondergut? Which is exclusive to John. John also writes much later than the other 2 and seems to have had definite access to a whole lot of other material, including his own. This morning I said we would look at the meaning of the word canon. Is it going to come up on the screen? Now, of course, canon is a musical term. There's the famous canon in D major by Pachelbel, which is often played at weddings as the retinue enters just before the bride appears. And the canon is also a big shot in the Anglican Church, an assistant to the bishop or something like that. But in our case, the word canon means measuring stick. In fact, it comes from a Greek word meaning measuring stick. What do I mean when I say Old Testament canon and when I say New Testament canon. I talk about the collection of books that made it into our Bible. Our Old Testament canon, for instance, has got how many books? Who said 75? Or did I just hear wrong? Let's just say I heard wrong, because that would be very far out. The Old Testament has a collection of books of 39, so those 39 books form the canon. Sometimes I throw the word from the front here, the word canon, not realizing perhaps there are people in the congregation who don't understand what I mean. It's not something that blows balls into the enemy, a canon. It is the collection officially allowed in the Bible. Why do I say officially allowed? Because there are some books outside the canon. And we're going to talk about that in a few moments' time. How many books are there in the New Testament canon? 27. Who said 75? Maybe my hearing's going. I am about to turn 45. Okay, so New Testament, 27 books, officially part of the canon. When I talk about the Old Testament, I almost want to put in brackets 39 books in the Protestant canon, because there are some additional books in the Catholic Bibles. It's what we call the Apocrypha. The Apocrypha comes from a Greek word which means hidden books. There are 13 books that the reformers in the 1500s threw out for various reasons. Just give me my next slide, please, Debs. Is it not deutero? Now the word deutero means second. So we who study the Bible, you can just imagine how I battled with all these funny words. The word deuterocanonical means books that are recognized by some church traditions, but not by all. Like the 13 books that for some or other reason, the reformers like John Calvin, Martin Luther, John Knox removed from the Protestant writings with the Great Reformation that swept across Europe and England in the 1500s. Now, somewhere between Malachi, which ends our Old Testament, and Matthew, which opens our New Testament, there's a period of 400 years. And the books of the Apocrypha cover that period of time. So we refer to an intertestamental time. It makes for very fascinating reading, and the Protestant church's approach to the Apocrypha is this: we are allowed to preach from those books, but not necessarily to build doctrine on any of those writings. It's not something that all Protestants agree on. I'm just giving you what the church officially stands for. So we've got books there like Zerachi, also known as Ecclesiasticus, not to be confused with Ecclesiastes, as one of our wisdom books in the Old Testament. For me, I love the Maccabees the most. So they would have lived when? 170 years before Jesus. The Maccabees were the ones who led the Jewish revolt after the Greeks slaughtered a pig on the altar in the Holy of Holies in the temple. And that's, of course, where the feast Hanukkah comes from. Hanukkah means the festival of lights, and it comes from when the temple was rededicated with the Maccabean revolt being led by 5 brothers, the sons of a priest. We talk about the Apocrypha not as extra-canonical. We talk about it as deuterocanonical. I don't know if you remember my teachings on Isaiah when we did the layout of the Bible. We talked about Isaiah, and then there's a part of Isaiah known as Deutero-Isaiah, the second Isaiah. And then there's even a Trito-Isaiah, the third Isaiah. The second Isaiah would be Isaiah chapters 40 to 55, and the third Isaiah was chapters 56 to 66. I can't explain it in great detail now. I'm just giving this as a little bit of an aside. I think what we need to know this evening is that there is material known as deuterocanonical, which means that some churches acknowledge those writings, others do not. Something we do agree on, however, is the stuff which is known as extra-canonical. Okay? Canonical. It means outside the canon. And this is material that every church tradition doesn't acknowledge. So even the Catholics would be against this particular group of writings. We must remember always that there had been a lot of consulting with each other and consulting with the Holy Spirit when it came to the process of what writings needed to be included in our canon, both Old Testament and New Testament. And sometimes material was rejected, and one day we will look at the basis of why some of it never made it into the canon. There was a gospel of Thomas, for instance, those praying about what the New Testament should have included in it decided not to include that. There was even a document being passed known as the Gospel of Judas. It was later found out that he couldn't possibly have written it because, remember, he took his own life, so he wouldn't have had chance to put something down on paper. But somebody kind of just borrowed his name and attached it to that document. Luckily, that was squashed in time before it did a whole lot of damage. There's also a Gospel of Mary that never made it into the New Testament because, unluckily for her, she was a female. And there was no way that was going to make it into the New Testament canon. So I suppose that some of this documentation still exists today, probably in a Vatican vault somewhere or wherever. But I believe that what we have necessary for our salvation, God provided in the canon. Okay? So what we need, we have in our Old and our New Testaments. What we need to not know, we've been spared. Let's talk a little bit about the shape and size of the New Testament. It can be roughly explained to have 4 parts. We have the Gospels, which aren't necessarily biographies, remember, for each Gospel author writes with a particular objective in mind, to try and achieve something in the reader's heart and head. The second part of the New Testament, there's only one history book. That's the book of Acts. It is the second part to Luke. So Luke ends on a little bit of a to be continued note, and we find the rest of the story in his writing of the book of Acts. In the Old Testament, we have a greater collection of history books, like 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel. Those are all history books. 1 Kings, 2 Kings. 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles. Esther, Nehemiah, the Judges, Joshua, all those guys. Those would fit into that category of history books. The New Testament has only one history book, and that is Luke's book of Acts. Then, of course, we have the epistles, the letters by Paul and by others. And then there's one apocalyptic writing known as the Revelation. I get quite hot under the collar when people always come to me with the difficult questions that come from the book of Revelations, as they say, and I just can't handle it. It's the Revelation, okay? That's what God gives to John as a vision on the Greek Isle of Patmos towards the end of the 1st century. A lot of it that doesn't make easy sense to us would have made sense to the early Christians because John was addressing them during a time of terrible persecution. The first Christian persecution was around about 64 AD under the horrible man, the Emperor Nero, and then 40 years later, another Roman emperor decided to implement terrible Christian persecution, and it was during that time and in that context that the Revelation was written. That emperor was known as Domitian, and he was one of 4 Roman emperors who tried to eliminate the church, but never, of course, got it right. Who can tell me, when we talk about apocalyptic writings, what is the apocalyptic writing of the Old Testament? The book of Daniel. So we've got those 2 apocalyptic writings in Scripture, Daniel in the Old Testament, and we must look at Daniel at some stage. It's probably quite relevant for the times in which we now live, and then the Revelation. Last year we looked at the Gospel of Mark. Of course you won't remember all that much because it's now 12 months on. So I just quickly want to recap. What are the main things that we need to keep in Mark even as we study Matthew? Most importantly, it is the earliest Gospel in our canon, okay? Maybe there were some primitive Gospels in existence before the Gospel of Mark. He is only the early one amongst the 4 that we have in our New Testament. I'm pretty sure that there are scribbles, incomplete Gospels. I don't know how original they would be. But when we say that Mark is the earliest Gospel, it means the earliest Gospel known to us. Okay? What is the other intriguing thing about Mark? It's this. He is known as the martyr gospel. When did Mark write? If Jesus died in 33 AD, more or less, what is Mark's date of writing? 64 AD, give or take a year. Mark was writing during the Neronian persecution, which was one of the most awful persecution the church ever had to face. You see, there was a fire that had broken out in Rome. Some historians say that the emperor himself had set it. But who did he blame? The Christians. And so a persecution, the first of 4 huge persecutions, broke out, and the church did suffer greatly. Mark is known as the martyr gospel because that's when he was writing, during a time where many martyrs were being made for the sake of the gospel and its expansion. In fact, it was this year where we have Peter and Paul sacrificing their lives for Jesus. We all know the story. Paul was probably beheaded because he was a Roman citizen, so they could get rid of him decently and in an acceptable way. Peter, who was not a Roman citizen, was, according to what we've got, the info available to us, sometimes we're not 100% sure about these things, but it's been very strongly suggested that he was crucified upside down. Because he had said, as they were nailing him to the crossbeam, apparently he exclaimed, "I am not worthy to die in the same way as my Lord." And so the Roman soldiers turned the cross on its head. The Vatican claims that the altar underneath the huge dome of St. Peter's Basilica stands directly on top of where St. Peter lies buried. Now, I have lots of Catholic friends that I love very dearly. I'm just not unshakably confident that that claim is entirely true. It might be true. We can unfortunately and very sadly not prove it. It's still a heck of a claim, hey? That dome that Michelangelo designed is quite impressive. Okay, so the other reason for why Mark is known as the martyr gospel is because he makes quite a big fuss of the price of following Jesus. The cost of discipleship. Was it Bonhoeffer who wrote on that? Eh? Cheap grace and costly grace, isn't it? During the Second World War. And it was Bonhoeffer who said to his followers, when Christ calls a man, in those days it would have been in male language, but if Christ calls a person, he calls that person, come and die. If you want to follow Jesus, there's going to be a price to pay. It is just how it is. We need to know that. I have a very controversial preacher friend in the Methodist Church. You've probably heard of him, Alan Story. And he always upsets his congregation when he says to them, if you want to follow Jesus, you better look good on wood. Because at some stage, somebody's going to crucify you. At some stage, you're going to bleed because you said yes to Jesus. And I'm pretty sure a lot of us have experienced that over the years, because following Jesus is not always easy, but it definitely is always worth it. And I trust that you will stick it out to the end, because those who endure to the end will be saved. Matthew 24, verse 12, I think. Okay, so I digress a little bit. So Mark is known as the earliest gospel, written when? 64 AD, 3 decades after Jesus. During this time, there were other people's writing and putting comments on paper. But what was the main thing that happened between Jesus' ascension and the first gospel being written? What developed here very, very strongly? The oral tradition. People telling stories about Jesus and remembering what he had done and what he had preached. Later, the oral tradition was written down and became known as the saying source. And in my research this week, I found something very interesting that I hadn't known before, and that is that people are now saying that when the oral tradition was eventually written down as a document, it was Matthew who had done so. But let me just check that fact for us before we claim it as fact. Okay, so Mark is written during the time of the Emperor Nero's persecution, at the same time when Paul and Peter got killed for their faith. And we also surmise that Mark never finished his gospel because he himself was killed for the faith. When you read Mark chapter 16, you will see that the Bibles we have will say that the original manuscript ended with verse 8. So it's in the middle of the resurrection account. Verses 9 to 20 were added much later. One can see that the style and the language use of these later verses is very different to what we would have had in the rest of Mark. People have come up with all sorts of suggestions for why Mark is not a complete gospel. The best bet seems to be that he was killed for his faith before he could actually finish writing his gospel. Others say that there used to be an ending, but it got lost, because of wear and tear, since there was only one single copy. And others say he never or there was an ending, but the authorities removed it. So who knows what actually happened? For what my opinion is worth, I think that he probably got killed before he had time writing an end to his very important gospel. One of the church fathers, known as Papias, he had quite a bit of influence in the 2nd century. He gives us the record that Mark's gospel was based directly on Peter's preaching. So if that is the case, Mark is a very important and irreplaceable document to us, because it's the closest that we have to Peter going around across the Mediterranean preaching. Okay, there are some verses in Mark which is Sondergut, not many, about 13, which were never included in either Matthew or Luke, which I think is very important to see how heavily the later authors of Gospels relied on Mark's original material. Let's talk about Matthew now. What can we say about Matthew? We can say this: he is the only author amongst the synoptic Gospels who was a disciple. We have John, who was a disciple, but he's not one of the synoptics. So out of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Matthew is the only one who was in that close group with Jesus, following in his shadow for 3 interesting and mind-blowing years. When we look at Matthew, we have to keep that in mind. That a lot of what he tells us, you would have heard firsthand. You would have seen firsthand. He was actually there when it happened. We can also talk about Matthew's time of writing. When did Mark write? 64 AD. Who was the emperor at the time? Nero. And people were being martyred left, right, and center. 2 years after this terrible persecution broke out, in 66 AD, the Jews revolted against the Romans. They had had enough of the oppression and the kind of force of Rome, and they took on the emperor. This revolt lasted 7 years. It ended in 73 AD. And how did that revolt end? Who do you think who won? Rome. Because they had better guns and better cannons and better equipment and better whatever. That Jewish revolt lasted 7 years. How does that revolt end in 73 AD? With what significant event which we see as the end of a particular time span? No? The destruction of the temple was in 70 AD. So the revolt still continued for another 3 years after that. I'm pretty sure you know this answer. You're just not getting it in your minds. In 73 AD, there was Masada. So it ended very tragically for the Jewish people. In the desert fortress on a hilltop close to the Dead Sea, where 2,000 Jews had taken shelter for many of the years of the revolt, it's the common belief that they took their own lives. They actually killed each other because suicide was so very frowned on. When the Romans broke into the gates of that fortress, they did still find some children and women alive. Masada had been one of Herod's summer palaces, and I've been there. It's quite an imposing place to visit, and it's amazing what they got right so high up on that hilltop. There were water canals, so when it rained, they would have had dams and pools to save water. There were gardens. There were things like barns, places to, storage houses. It was actually quite a lacquer city up on the hill there. Of course, it was only a matter of time before the Romans got in there. How did the Romans get in there? By building a ramp onto which they took a battering ram. So it must have been quite a bit of panic stations for the Jews inside the fortress to see outside through the holes in the gates or whatever, how the Romans were building this ramp and how they were hauling up the battering ram to get in. They still thought that taking their own lives or being dead by the time the Romans broke through would be better than surrendering to Roman oppression. It was a very tragic and difficult time in the life of the Jewish nation. As part of the Romans' reaction to the Jewish revolt, they of course destroyed the temple. In 70 AD, the Jews had become such an agitation to Rome. Rome thought, what is the worst thing that we can possibly do to the Jews? How do we get to destroy their heart? We flatten their temple. So to this day, after 70 AD, there's never been a temple again in Jerusalem. People speak of a third temple. This was actually the second temple, the temple that Jesus knew. The first temple had been destroyed by the Babylonians, remember, 600 years before Jesus, when they invaded Jerusalem and kind of burnt down everything. When they got back from exile, Zerubbabel kind of led a project to rebuild the temple. Although it was a bit small, people were very disappointed because it wasn't as nice as the one that Solomon had given them. But at least they had a temple. At least they could continue sacrifices, right? And tragically, in 70 AD, that temple was destroyed. Herod, always promoting religion in his area, the country that he oversaw, did allow for expansion. So the small temple of Zerubbabel after the exile was renovated again and again and again. So it ended up being quite big by the time of Jesus. It is round about 70 AD that Matthew's gospel is written. There are some very strong arguments that Matthew was written before 70 AD, because some scholars believe that if Matthew was written after 70 AD, he would have most surely mentioned the destruction of the temple. So I'm just putting that out there. Most of my sources agree that 70 AD more or less was when Matthew saw the light. So about 6 years after Mark. What did Matthew use as the foundation of his writings? You would have had access to Ekaniwari? To Mark. You would have had access to what he had witnessed himself, his own material, which would probably be Zondergoed stuff, eh? By Matthew's time, however, the oral tradition was no longer oral. It had been written down. What name was the oral tradition given once it was on paper? Quelle, which is the German word for saying. That is the saying source. Saying. So in the Quelle material, we don't have any of the miracles of Jesus. It is purely a collection of his sayings, what he taught, what he preached, what he proclaimed. So in Quelle, we won't have the birth narratives, for instance, or the crucifixion, or the resurrection, or any of the healings, or people being raised from the dead. It was a pure source that had developed with the sayings of Jesus. So when Matthew sat down, thinking back of what had happened to him 40 years ago when he was drawn out of his tax collector's booth, he sat down and he grabbed a copy of Mark, which was very precious because there weren't many copies around. He got hold of the Quelle source, which was no longer only an oral tradition. There was actually a paper with its name. And he also visited and revisited his own memories of 3 years of being with Jesus. He put it all together, and the result was the beautiful and powerful and meaningful Gospel of Matthew. Next week, we're going to look at some of the important points in Matthew's Gospel. For there are very definite things that he emphasizes that the others don't push hard on. Okay? So if you're willing to be here, I'm going to be willing to come. Debs, we need to just put out a morning so that I can prepare next week's talk. Okay? Probably Thursday. So is that a deal? We're going to continue this journey next week through the Gospel of Matthew. I've given you a good background now. I don't want this to just be info. I want it to change the the way you read the gospel, okay? I want it to start making more sense to you. I want you to be more able to put the puzzle pieces together. Here's a little bit of application for you as I end. Worship team, I'm going to call on you in a second's time. But let's read together this little poem by Arthur McPhee. It is titled, The Gospel According to You. So, whether we like it or not, a lot of people don't read their Bibles. A lot of the people we mix with and sometimes are even friends with, or do I say family of, don't bother with issues of faith anymore. I don't know if your family is anything like mine, but there is the odd person who, even in my family, is not particularly interested in a relationship with Jesus. The way we live, however, and the way we love them becomes our version of the gospel. We think that those near and dear to us don't watch us. But in the meantime, back at the ranch, we end up being the only gospel that they will ever read. So we need to check our ways and change what within us is not Christ-like. There are some people we know who will never think of attending a church service, not even over Easter, dare I say. The closest they will get to Jesus being within their reach would be their contact with us. So I want to know from you, what is the gospel according to you? I read to you this poem. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are read by more than a few. But the one that is most read and commented on is the gospel according to you. You are writing a gospel, a chapter each day, by the things that you do and the words that you say. Men read what you write, whether faithless or true. Say, what is the gospel according to you? Do men read his truth and his love in your life? Or has yours been too full of malice and strife? Does your life speak of evil, or does it ring true? So tell me, what is the gospel according to you?
By the tax booth near the shore, you heard the master's voice and more. You rose and left your worldly ways to follow Christ all of your days. With pen in hand and faith so true, you wrote the gospel clear and new, a witness to his love and light. You turned the darkness into bright. Oh, Saint Matthew, heart made pure, through God's mercy strong and sure, teach us how to leave behind all that chains the soul and mind. Your life a beacon bold and bright, lead us to the path of light. You showed that grace can still redeem even lives we wouldn't deem. A sinner called to serve the Lord, you proved the power of his word. You saw his face, you felt his call, you chose to rise, surrender all. Now in heaven hear our plea, help us live in charity. Oh, Saint Matthew, heart made pure, through God's mercy strong and sure, teach us how to leave behind all that chains the soul and mind. Your life a beacon bold and bright, Follow Christ, the true